I'm David Hutchins with VOA's Middle East Monitor. Coming up, Arab observers arrive in Syria in attempts to stop what some are calling an ongoing massacre. A series of explosions rock Baghdad. Is this what security will look like now that U.S. troops have withdrawn? And a unique memorial to honor U.S. soldiers killed during Middle Eastern conflicts. It's all ahead on The Voice of America. An advanced team of Arab League observers have arrived in Syria amid a mounting death toll from a crackdown on opposition unrest. The team arrived on Thursday to lay the groundwork for Arab League monitors who arrive over the coming weeks. The monitors will see whether Syria follows through on a pledge to stop attacks on anti-government protesters. Activists say at least 21 people were killed today following security force raids and clashes. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights say 9 of the deaths were in the Flashpoint region of Homs. Syria's government agreed to allow the observers into the country under global pressure to stop its bloody crackdown on dissent. The Arab League has also been urging Syria to withdraw its security forces from neighborhoods and begin talks with the opposition. Syrian opposition groups say troops have killed at least 250 people since Monday, one of the bloodiest periods since the uprising began in March. Meanwhile, the U.S. Wednesday warned Syria of additional punitive steps by the international community if the government of President Assad fails to halt its crackdown on protesters. The U.S. call came before the expected arrival of the monitors. VOA's David Gaulis reports from the State Department.
U.S. officials are expressing dismay that Syrian security forces are escalating repressive steps only a day before the long-awaited arrival of the first members of an Arab League monitoring force. Amid a reported death toll in Syrian clashes that approached 200 in a 2-day span, the White House said Wednesday words by the Assad government have no credibility when they continue to be followed by outrageous and deplorable actions. It said while finally signing an Arab League peace protocol on Monday, the Damascus government has already flagrantly violated commitments under it to end violence and withdraw security forces from residential areas. The White House urged what it termed Syria's few remaining supporters to warn Damascus that if the Arab League initiative is not fully implemented, the international community will take additional steps to pressure the Assad regime to stop its crackdown. State Department spokeswoman Victoria Nuland said such action should begin with tighter economic sanctions.
First and foremost, tightening the sanctions. So any countries that are continuing to trade with the regime or otherwise line its coffers and give it fuel, food, money, anything that it can use against its own people, they ought to examine hard their own national policies, strengthening international sanctions as well.
Syria expert Andrew Tabler, visiting fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, says Syria was apparently able in negotiations with the Arab League to pare down the number of monitors going in from several hundred to about 120. He attributes this week's surge in violence to an effort by Damascus authorities to decimate the opposition before monitors arrive.
They want to be able to kill and finish off a lot of people before the monitors show up. They know that a lot of these things, activities that they have been carrying out, are now going to be have the potential for being spotted and reported upon. So they want to make sure that they take care of that. Second, I think a lot of the opposition over the last few weeks has gone down the road towards more of an armed opposition, and I think that's getting a response from the Assad regime and driving up the death toll.
Tabler said the currently envisioned Arab League monitoring force is not nearly large enough, and unless something can be done to increase the number of observers, their presence will be irrelevant and not solve the crisis. The White House statement said the only way to bring about the change the Syrian people deserve is for President Assad to leave power. The Washington Institute's Tabler, however, said he sees no inclination by the Syrian leader to depart and that U.S. policy as a consequence is stuck. David Gaulis, VOA News, the State Department.
The government crackdown in Syria is having economic reverberations across the region. In addition to sanctions imposed, many transport firms are finding it too risky to enter the country. As Henry Ridgewell reports from the Turkish border, that's having consequences on traders on both sides of the frontier.
At the Cilvegozu border crossing in Turkey, the trickle of trucks, cars and people coming from Syria bear testament to the violence beyond the frontier. The latest arrivals are 2 cars bearing Saudi Arabian license plates. The doors and windows are ridden with bullet holes. The Turkish occupants had been travelling back to their jobs in Saudi when they came under attack just a few kilometres into Syria. One of the drivers, Nasim Zeytinci, describes what happened.
Suriye'ye giderken işte oradaki köprünün üstüne çıktığımız zaman
we were driving in Syria. As we went over a bridge, we were attacked by some gunmen, but we don't know who they were, he says. We sped off for around 500 metres under fire. Then we turned off into a local neighbourhood and the people there helped us. An ambulance came to take the injured passenger to hospital. There is now a permanent queue of trucks waiting on the Turkish side. Drivers say sometimes it stretches 10 kilometres. Transport firms are increasingly wary of sending people and cargo into Syria. Mehmet Eşki is supposed to be delivering drilling pipes to Dubai.
Yolda can güvenliği yoktur ve işlemler durmuş aldığımız son bilgiye göre burada.
There is no security, and the latest information we have is that on the Syrian side of the border, they don't give you your paperwork, he says. We were here waiting for a couple of days for our Saudi visas. We finally got those, but now there is no security in Syria, so we cannot go. Last night in the news, he adds, the foreign minister and the governor of Antakya warned people not to go to Syria unless they really have to. Eşki's transport company decided to reroute the shipment via Iraq, a much longer route and not without its own dangers. But it's not just the violence that's hitting trade. Turkey has imposed financial and travel sanctions on the Syrian government. The US and the European Union are tightening their economic sanctions on Syrian banks and oil firms. But questions remain over their effectiveness, says London-based analyst Shashank Joshi of the Royal United Services Institute.
If the Arab League imposes very harsh sanctions, UN or by itself, would they be policed? Now, we know Syria's borders against Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq are long and porous, very hard to police sanctions. So just like we saw in the 1990s with Iraq, would oil embargoes or restrictions on goods really be effective? Can we stop stuff coming in and out of Syria?
Effective or not, Joshi says sanctions are the option of choice for keeping international pressure on the Syrian government. That leaves commerce in limbo, with world powers lacking an appetite for military intervention as violence inside Syria worsens. Henry Ridgewell for VOA News on the Turkey-Syria border.
A series of bomb blasts hit the Iraqi capital today, leaving at least 63 dead and more than 180 wounded. The attacks came as Iraq is gripped in a political crisis between Shiite Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and Sunni political rivals inside the government. Edward Uranian reports for VOA from Cairo.
Ambulances ferried casualties to hospitals across Baghdad following the multiple explosions that seemed to target mostly Shiite areas. Witnesses say most of the apparently coordinated attacks occurred as people were heading off to work. Iraqi government TV indicated that 4 explosions were of car bombs, while 10 were the result of roadside bombs. Baghdad security chief said police found and disabled 6 other car bombs before they exploded. The Sunni Arab satellite channel Al-Baghdadiyya also reported failed assassination attempts against a top central bank official and a police general and a rocket attack in a Shiite neighborhood. There were no immediate claims of responsibility. Hassan, a witness to one of the bomb blasts, complained that innocent civilians were paying the price of quarrels among politicians. He warns politicians to stop making innocent people pay for their disagreements. The terror attacks come during the political crisis which erupted this week when Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, a Shiite, tried to arrest Sunni Vice President Tariq al-Hashimi, accusing him of involvement in terrorist plots. Hashimi then fled to Kurdistan in northern Iraq. Mr. Maliki demanded Wednesday that Kurdish leaders hand Hashimi over for prosecution of his alleged crimes. Kurdistan Regional President Masoud Barzani is refusing to do so. Hashemi, for his part, claims that the charges against him are trumped up, telling VOA's Persian news network that the conflict is the result of outside pressure from both Iran and Syria on Prime Minister Maliki.
لدي حقيقة المؤشرات قوية جدا أن دولتين جارتين منزعجة من موقف.
He insists that Iran and Syria, which are not pleased with some of his recent statements and which are close to Prime Minister Maliki, are behind what he calls the fabrication of the entire crisis and the escalating media campaign against him. The Prime Minister's spokesman, Ali Dubag, retorted that Vice President Hashemi and not Mr. Maliki was turning the crisis into a media circus. He says Hashemi should make his case before the judicial system and not in front of the press. He insists that TV is turning the matter into a dangerous political crisis. Edward Uranian for VOA News, Cairo.
Now, earlier, VOA's Carla Babb spoke with Hiba Hisham, who works for the Al Hura television network. Hisham was near one of the blasts in Baghdad.
Today at 7:30 in the morning, all the bombings went off consecutively in different parts of the country, in Karkh and Rasafa, which is, it didn't target a certain community. It didn't target only Sunnis or only Shias. It targeted all Iraqis in general. Over 12 bombings, 12 car bombings, roadside bombings, and explosive belts. Over 200 citizens were between dead and wounded as a result of these bombings.
And so when you went out there, what did you see? Was it pretty chaotic after the explosion?
Well, they blocked all the streets. It took most of our staff, most of our employees over 4 hours to get to the bureau. There hasn't been that many bombings in Iraq in general, but a lot of Iraqis were afraid of the withdrawal of the American troops. They felt like the Iraqi army was still not ready to take over the security files. They were not prepared. They didn't have any training, professional training. And but a few days ago when a problem occurred, a very big crisis occurred between the two biggest blocs, Al-Araqiya and the State of Law Alliance, concerning Al-Hashemi, Tariq Al-Hashemi, the vice president, being involved in terrorist operations. Citizens started having this fear of the security, the violence, the security violence escalating. But of course, nobody expected, over 12 bombings in one day.
As the U.S. military leaves Iraq after more than 8 years of war, the country's weakened infrastructure struggles to provide daily needs. Sharon Bean reports that despite billions of dollars set aside for reconstruction, Iraqis interviewed at several locations say they still cannot rely on public services.
Baghdad is a noisy, crowded city, and despite years of turmoil, new restaurants and shops are opening. But it is also a city that struggles to function, much like the rest of the country. Razor wire and concrete blast walls are slowly becoming a thing of the past. But nearly 9 years of war and earlier years of international sanctions have left many Iraqis without steady, basic services. There is seldom enough electricity, and power outages are common unless residents can connect to generators. Fish seller Jafar Abdul Hamza says life is difficult.
We are suffering from a lot of things. Security is better, but we suffer from a lack of electricity and water.
Medical services are especially lacking, even at Ghazi al-Hariri Hospital, one of Baghdad's best. Patient Khalis Hussein says he suffers more from hospital conditions than he does from his kidney failure.
Doctors are good, and so is the medical staff. But there is a lack of services. The elevators do not work, and the stairs are locked.
Still, trauma surgeon Ahmed Saleh says things have improved since the mass terrorist bombing casualties of 5 years ago.
The situation changed dramatically in the last 2 years when the attacks decreased, and we received nowadays just the road traffic accidents, the other emergencies not related to trauma, but we still receive some trauma patients due to bullets, missiles, and a few attacks of explosions, but not the big explosions as in 2005, 2006.
Today there are fewer bomb victims, but the lack of experienced doctors is a problem.
We got all the supplies that we need, but we need training. We need an outside training. Let's say in the United States, United Kingdom, to improve our work. We got the experience, but we don't know how to use it.
At home, Iraqis like English teacher Wamid Rafat blame the government for the lack of services.
Nothing. There is no reconstruction in the country, and I do not see anything that is being provided for the interest of my children's future.
There has been some rebuilding, just not as much as many Iraqis expected from billions of dollars in international aid. Sharon Bain, VOA News, Baghdad.
The relationship between the United States and Egypt could be entering a new phase. Many Egyptians are disappointed with recent U.S. policy decisions and its history of backing former autocrat Hosni Mubarak. The United States is also searching for ways to redefine the relationship by keeping open communication with the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, or SCAF, a Senate Muslim parties who will likely dominate the new parliament, and the Revolutionary Youth. Former Egyptian ambassador to the U.S., Nabil Fahmy, told VOA's Middle East senior correspondent Mohammed al-Shanawi that Egyptian disappointment has more to do with American policy decisions than America itself.
From the Egyptian perspective, they were obviously surprised by the popular uprising, which culminated in the revolution. And you saw a guarded, slow transformation in the positions. In all honesty, I find that understandable. Even Egyptians were surprised by the revolution. And of course, Americans were looking at it not from the perspective of the aspirations of the Egyptian people, but from the perspective of how it affects their interest globally and regionally. And they had a long-standing relationship with the Egyptian government. So it's, in my perspective, it's understandable. During the revolution itself, since the revolution, President Obama made very strong statements about economic support for the Egyptian people and the new Egyptian government. Frankly, that has been, on the one hand, appreciated. On the one hand, it's been very difficult to transform that into actual concrete support, and that appears to be a bit more disappointing.
Is it true that there is a rising anti-American sentiment in Egypt, and how would you explain that?
I think what you're seeing is typical rhetorical style of any political campaign. We have moved from the revolution itself, which was a domestic issue 100%, to competing parties and individuals in an election. And when that happens, some foreign policy issues come in, not many, and frankly there still was not many, but even when there are only a few foreign policy issues, given the size of America, given its weight globally, and given its positions in the Middle East, including on the peace process, that tends to come up. The Egyptians were also quite disappointed by the position taken by America vis-a-vis the application by Palestine for membership to the UN, and that may have been the source of the statements that you feel are anti-American. So I still believe it's an anti-American policy that you're hearing, not anti-Americanism per se.
The legacy of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are two of the longest conflicts fought by the U.S. military, and really has yet to be measured the cost of life there. But as VOA's Kane Faribaugh reports, the cost of that war is being made more visible at a memorial in the Midwestern state of Illinois.
To say that retired laborer Mike Ferrari is patriotic is somewhat of an understatement.
But we met all three of these young men, and
his nickname, after all, is inspired by the war-fighting movie character Rambo.
One guy told me if they cut me, I'd bleed red, white, and blue. It's just the way I am, and it's a name I've had for about 20 years now, and it just Most people don't know my real name. They just call me by Rambo.
In the wake of the terrorist attacks on the United States in 2001, Ferrari wanted to contribute in some way to the fight against terrorism. Then, in 2003, he heard volunteers were building a memorial near his home in Illinois that would honor U.S. military personnel who died in the Middle East.
And I came over to volunteer because it was my way of fighting terror, because I was too old to go in the military at that time.
Ferrari helped build what is now one of the most extensive memorials honoring those who died in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Middle East Conflicts Wall Memorial in Marseilles, Illinois, lists the names of more than 6,000 men and women who served in the Middle East since 1979 and died in the line of duty. More than 3/4 of the names are casualties of the 9-year-long Iraq War.
The rule number 1 of war is young men die, and there's no way to change that rule.
It is a rule that Ferrari's son Matt knows well. He served 2 tours in Iraq with the U.S. Army, including a stint in Baghdad in 2006 at the height of a bloody insurgency.
Caleb was usually on point of everything. He always had a joke about something.
Now, when he visits the memorial, 3 names on the wall have special meaning.
Caleb Lufkin, Gavin Ranke, and Brian Quinton. We were all in the same platoon. We had cookouts and numerous occasions where we were together all the time.
Hi, I'm Private First Class Caleb Lufkin.
All 3 of Ferrari's close friends died from wounds they sustained in a bomb blast while on patrol in Baghdad. Despite the loss, Matt Ferrari says he has no regrets about his service in Iraq.
There's not a part of me that asks, was it worth it? I know in my mind and my heart, when I went in, I did it of my own free will. I knew I was writing a check for up to and including my life. And as well as all the names on this wall, they did the same thing. They knew what they were getting into when they got into it. Do I think that it's a good thing we're out of there? Absolutely. Did it take too long? Definitely. Is anybody to blame for it? Not at all.
Though the Iraq War is over, Mike Ferrari says some battles continue for his son.
He'll live with the mental anguish of losing his friends and fellow soldiers for the rest of his life.
But Matt Ferrari has his father, also a veteran, and a community around him committed to helping heal his war wounds, both visible and hidden, while remembering those soldiers whose names are listed on this Riverside Memorial. Kane Fairbaugh, VOA News, Marseilles, Illinois.
And finally, a hearing to determine whether a U.S. Army intelligence analyst will be court-martialed for allegedly passing classified documents to WikiLeaks is expected to conclude today. Prosecutors and attorneys for Private First Class Bradley Manning will present closing arguments during proceedings at Fort Meade, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. Manning faces 22 charges, including aiding the enemy. On Wednesday, experts for the prosecution testified they found evidence the intelligence analyst downloaded diplomatic cables onto music compact discs that were sent to the anti-secrecy website WikiLeaks. During the 6 days of testimony, Manning's lawyers have described their client as a troubled man who should not have been allowed to access classified material while serving in Iraq between November 2009 and May 2010. Lawyers also said the military's oversight of the computers was lax, citing testimony by the witnesses that soldiers played video games on the computers. Manning's been in custody for 19 months. He could spend the rest of his life in prison if found guilty. This has been VOA's Middle East Monitor. Join us Monday through Friday. News from the region, interest to the region. International edition is next with David Byrd. Thanks for tuning in to Voice of America.
Are you following the uprisings in Syria, Egypt, and other Arab Spring countries? Want to contribute? Voice of America has launched a new social journalism website for the Arab Spring called Middle East Voices. Incubated by our thousands of fans on Facebook and Twitter and dedicated journalists at VOA, this site takes a new approach to covering the region through investigative journalism, publishing your viewpoints and harnessing social media to tell stories in a new, innovative way. Become a contributor at MiddleEastVoices.com.